Welcome, everyone. I have with me today Dr. Basani Baloyi, and I'm Efemia Chela. I work for Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, the South African office, and we've been holding a series of discussions, talking to experts, talking to intellectuals about contemporary issues. And Dr. Basani Baloyi joins us today for the latest installment. How are you, Basani?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Weather's looking up. We're having a bit of a fake summer. It's going very well.
Going very well. So far, so good. Thanks for inviting me to your podcast.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming. So, Dr. Basani Baloyi is a feminist development economist. She holds advanced degrees from UCT, WITS, and SOAS in London. She's the Climate, Energy, and Infrastructure Program lead at the Institute for Economic Justice. Dr. Baloyi was part of the team that created Oxfam's South Africans Women's Work and Inequality in South Africa report. And in her analysis, she often uses a feminist intersectional lens to analyze the state of inequality in South Africa and the structural drivers of economic equality. So those are the sort of things we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, I was wondering, Basani, if you could speak a bit about the ways in which women are uniquely affected by economic and labor market inequalities.
Great question. I think in terms of how they are uniquely affected is how they have been historically placed. So if we think about how the apartheid system functioned for women, obviously there was the dispossession of land, and through the dispossession of land, people then were forced to go into work. And there was a whole tax system that almost forced people to go into forms of work for survival at very super exploitative wage levels. The way in which the system worked is that it was men, through various controls, who were able to be migrant laborers in that sense, and women had to stay in the homelands, largely Black women. The way in which the system worked was that, coming from the likes of Walpy, is that women were used as a way of cross-subsidizing the capital for the way in which it was underpaying Black men. So they are unable to work and they are forced into subsistence farming, and that social reproduction is then used as a way of cross-subsidizing the super exploitative wages of the Black men. This changes in time, and post-apartheid, of course, those influx control measures are done away with. But then what you find is that where women are placed, first of all, is that they still have lower labor force participation than men, meaning that those who are of working age and are either employed or unemployed, the proportion of that is far lower than men. Similarly, the fact that there are more men that are employed than women. All of these types of things talk to the history, but also what continues. Part of what continues is the fact that women are having to do far more unpaid care work than men, which means that they participate far less in terms of their labor market participation, but also the opportunities for work. Historically, in terms of now where women are placed as they go into the workforce, their inclusion has also happened with greater casualization of the workforce and the outsourcing of the workforce. This has affected both men and women, but it's been interesting that as they have entered the workforce, that is what has happened. In the manufacturing sector and like the industrial sector, where wages tend to be higher, for instance, those are sectors where you wouldn't find women as much. And where you do find them, they are doing catering or they are the cleaners within the sector. So there are all these ways in which the capitalist system has almost positioned women as a way of cross-subsidizing for its own exploitation. In terms of their lower labor force participation, what drives that in terms of like the high unpaid care work, in part the high rates of unemployment that you find amongst women rather than men, but also where they show up in the various sectors, where you'd find that they're either domestic workers or predominantly low paid service jobs, but where they appear in industry and in the manufacturing sectors or mining or whatever, they tend to be cleaners and the like.
It definitely seems like the gender division of labor is still present even outside the home. I mean, you're talking about jobs which are viewed as feminized, cleaning, care work, domestic work, low-level jobs. And it's interesting to see how that is also a product of history as well. You describe yourself as a feminist development economist. What role do you believe feminism has to play in economic justice?
Well, I describe myself as a feminist, and then there's the development economist. It's fundamentally important because I think what feminists do is that they show the contradiction of capitalism insofar as it exploits the very thing that helps to maintain the system. So how we talk about this is that if you think about care work, for instance, basically social reproduction, that is work that is crucial to get people ready for work, without which people are not ready for work. So what feminists do is that they show the interconnection between economic reproduction, which is the space of what is called productive work, and then the social reproduction, which happens in our homes, in our communities and the like, to show the interconnection between the two. And to say that much of this type of work is unappreciated, it's not looked at all. So feminist analysis, and in not appreciating it, it brings not only the crisis in economic reproduction itself. So think about what the crises, what COVID has shown us in terms of our healthcare system and how that has an impact on the economy. Not only does it impact economic reproduction, but the impact is also felt in social reproduction itself. So if our education system is in crisis, if our healthcare system is in crisis, we don't have water, if we don't have all these things that allow for the system to function, it causes dysfunction everywhere. And so this is what I think is key about feminist analysis, is to bring these two into conversation so that they are not seen as separate, but they are deeply interlinked, and to show the contradictions of the capitalist system, not in undervaluing and as a result undermining itself.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, social reproductive labor, for those who don't know, what we're talking about when we use that term is things like cleaning the home, housework, child rearing, sort of unpaid labor. And it's interesting that it's almost as if, because that's undervalued and unpaid in the home, when it's professionalized, people will say things like, well, babysitters are too expensive, or domestic workers cost too much. And so the fact that it's undervalued in the home reflects in the labor market, where it's very difficult for women to fight for higher wages in those professions as well, because it's taken for granted. This is supposed to be a thing.
Absolutely.
Also, that socially women are supposed to enjoy, supposedly, that this is nurturing care work that comes naturally, and all those kind of social assumptions, I think, make it more difficult for women to gain kind of parity in the workplace as well.
That is so fundamentally true. So what you then see, as like in terms of what I was talking about earlier, was the fact that when now women have moved into the workplace, even in spaces of industry, the spaces that they occupy still mimic the household. So if they go into manufacturing, or many of them are not operators, they are in the canteens, or they are the cleaning service, or they are like the administrator. There's a way in which the system takes from the gender division that happens at the household to replicate it within the economy. And again, that is not seen as work. It's undervalued. As you're saying, making it extremely hard for women to agitate. And also, it's the kind of work which is also very difficult to organize women amongst, right? So if you think about where collective bargaining and where worker organizations are far more stronger, it's not in the sectors that women particularly occupy, the dominance being domestic work. So making it extremely hard for them to agitate. I mean, people who've done work, for instance, on domestic work, speak about how the tight intimacy that is replicated within that kind of relationship, and the individualized relationship with someone who would be the employee, how difficult then it becomes to organize within that sector and to have voice, because these would be women who in their household, they would also suffer layers of patriarchy that then are performed in the workplace as well.
Yes, and I think that intimacy is something that's very important. I know Shireen Ali, looking at domestic workers and domestic workers unions, was describing how someone, for example, on the factory floor, there's a whole hierarchy of grievances. But if you work in a home and your boss is one woman often wealthier, often older, often in this country white. You as a domestic worker, how do you enter a collective bargaining process with someone like that whose meals you make,
Exactly.
who's an individual person who you see every day, who you relate to as a woman, but who is also very much your boss?
Exactly.
And so a lot of domestic workers, they are an industry, but they don't function like other industries because they're working in individual, very different homes, which poses a unique
Absolutely.
problem for mobilization.
This is the key debate then in terms of minimum wage settings and the like, which sectors are covered by such, given the uniqueness of the particular industry and also their feminization from seasonal agricultural workers. You know, there's something very particular about that and how organizing in those sectors becomes far more difficult, and then what it means in terms of livelihood.
I'd like to shift the focus of our conversation a bit more to the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic, which has changed our lives forever, and particularly has changed labor forever. Some people are working more from home, which also brings up social reproduction issues. In many countries, many women are dropping out of the workforce in order to take care of ill relatives, etc. So what effects do you think COVID-19 has had on gender inequality to do with labor in South Africa?
What COVID-19 first of all showed us is the importance of care work. Because when we think about who was seen as essential, it was those who were care workers, both at home and within the workforce. That's number one. But number two, it is also, in showing its importance, for many women, it's increased care work. Right? It's not only the taking care of those who are ill, but it's also many children, for instance, have not been able to go to school, or their education has been disrupted. So raising the amount of homeschooling that then has to take place, which again, that's care work. I mean, a statistic that report showed is that women who are employed, they spend more time doing unpaid care work than a man that's unemployed. So now imagine what that means within this context, where you are almost trapped in your household and you're having to deal everything. So clearly it has worsened it, with many women, as you're saying, having to leave the workforce. But it has not been helped by the fact that the caregivers grant, for instance, how that was a grant that was meant to support caregivers in response to COVID-19, and how that was taken away, and the impact that had on women, and as a result, food insecurity, because many people will have been retrenched. And so it has not been helped by the way in which the state has continued with its austerity measures, and therefore has deepened the inequalities, deepened the dread of care, right? And the burden of care on women as a result, because of the lack of social safety net on a crisis that they didn't bring upon themselves.
Another thing that I found quite interesting was a statistic that I found, and it said that it would take the pay of 461 Black women from the bottom 10% of earners to make as much as the average white male CEO takes home in a year.
Yes.
And that's astronomical, the fact that we do have a gender pay gap still, and that it's so wide. I mean, 461 women to one white male CEO is huge. What kind of steps are being taken to rectify the gender wage gap? And also the fact that often women work without work contracts, without benefit. Often in the workplace, women who have children are penalized in their career. They struggle to break through the glass ceiling.
You're quite right in saying that we operate in a neoliberal regime in which the entry of women was also met with the deepening outsourcing and casualization of work into the workplace. What that has done is that it has depressed wages for women and Black men as well. It has depressed wages. And of course, women, the majority of women are placed in more lower wage service jobs. And so how the system has worked is, in its heyday, when there was some level of growth that was happening, was to extend credit as a way of ensuring that for at least those who are working, they can use that credit as a way of managing their low wages. And this has been a strategy across the globe, which is why we ended up arriving at the global financial crisis in terms of how instruments were then used to make more money from people who were unemployed in America. Similar tactics were operating in this country, and which is why our household indebtedness has been so low. So there are capitalists that earn astronomical wages or salaries, right? Because of a system where we are ensuring that we are pushing the maximization of profits and wages, not really investing, but investing in like short-term speculative activity and tying CEO pay to how well the company is doing. Because through that, then you ensure that the CEO is doing all they can to maximize the shares of the shareholders. And that includes cost minimization. That includes like how they would do that would include cost minimization, casualization, outsourcing, disinvestment even. Because it's interesting that the growth in CEO pay has happened when still we are not investing in the actual, and our activity in the stock markets, it does not match up to the investments that are actually being done on the ground that help to employ more people. But the thing is, we have laws, but do we actually have the capacity to enforce them is another thing. I mean, now we have the law around labor brokering to say that if an employee works for more than 3 months and is employed through a labor broker, they are to be treated as though they are now permanent. But that is, for a certain wage threshold. So if you earn below 205,000 Rand, then you can do that, right? So that was a constitutional court ruling. So that is enforced now. However, employers still find ways of circumventing that piece of legislation. We don't have as much people who, I'm now forgetting what they are called, but who go into companies to supervise the fact that the contracts are there and people are employed under the contract terms that they should be employed in. So in spite of the laws, in spite of the interventions by law, without the enforcement, both in terms of capacity and capability and the resources to actually enforce those laws, then you see a continuation of this cost minimization drive that then creates these huge wage disparities. Other laws that are in place are, I think it's Section 27 of the Employment Equity, which basically can be used as a way of reducing wage disparities, right? And that has never really been enforced. There hasn't been really a campaign to use that as a way of reducing wage disparities. I know that in the report, we mentioned some kind of a cap on CEO pay, for instance, which is something that happens in Italy, where it's not just about having a minimum wage, but it's also having a ceiling as a way of dealing with these disparities. Beyond that, there are other things, again, that come at the level of social reproduction. What are we doing in terms of skills training, education, the like? And then when it comes to this financialization of the economy, how are we stopping that so that we ensure that the money that is available can be invested for more employment absorption, so that more people are then employed and we can get the circulation of the economy, which is currently not taking place at the minute. In fact, what we are doing is we are not regulating the financial sector in a way that prevents financialization from continuing. And this maintains the same structure that basically excludes people and women in particular.
In your view, are there any pressing actions which could help rectify the economic inequalities that exist along gender lines? And those are actions by the state, actions by community-based organizations. What are the pressing things that could change that you think could help?
That's a question. I think for me, the most pressing shift that needs to take place is our macroeconomic policy. It's the one thing that really, it's one of the key things that is constraining deepened instruments that is perpetuating levels of economic and gender inequality that we currently experience. The fact that we, like our monetary policy, for instance, does not target full employment. It's structured in a way that is helpful to capital by targeting interest rates, because it knows that is important to capital, because this is how they earn their money. This is how their savings are basically protected. That undermines our ability to invest in the economy in a way that would generate greater levels of employment that we see. But then our macroeconomic framework is also damaging. And without those levels of investments, right, if we don't have a macroeconomic framework that is targeted towards full employment and one that makes sure that there are controls that limit the transactions that are not built towards investing in the economy, but that are built to profiting for those who are the holders of capital, which currently exists now, then we are short-circuiting the extent to which we can actually employ more people, generate the incomes that are required, tax those people to then invest more, right? Both in the various sectors, but also in our education system and the like. Similarly, our macroeconomic framework, the way in which it's constructed, is that with our budgetary cuts, those deepen gender inequality, right? If we are having cuts to healthcare, cuts to education, those are cuts to women, because then you are leaving it up to women to fill in those gaps. And then they take up the burden of the various unpaid care work, because government services that they would rely on are just not there. And again, that constraint on women, or that constraint in the ability for us to have workers that then can fully participate in the economy because of the way in which we are constraining the household and forcing the household to take the place of the state in meeting key services, then we are not producing the kinds of workers that would be able to then be productive in the economy. So we are just creating another crisis. So for me, it's the macroeconomic policy that is very key, that has to shift, that is undermining levels of investments that would allow for more people to be employed, and also levels of investment required in the social infrastructure that would ensure that women are able to then participate in the economy, because they would be relieved of their unpaid care work.
Thank you so much for that and for all your insights. It's been a very fruitful and rich discussion that I think a lot of people will be able to take a lot away from. And thank you to our audience for joining our discussion. You can find more critical texts and research developed by the South African Office of Tricontinental on our website.